Good day. Despite American calls for restraint from Russia in response to the sanctions announcement which President Biden made on last week, the Russians have, as might have been expected, as indeed was inevitable, responded to the sanctions that the United States has imposed upon them. Now, there's been some suggestions that these Russian sanctions are measured and that they don't actually indicate that a desire on the part of the Russians to escalate. In fact, I think when one unpacks the sanctions more carefully, one understands where the Russians are going and the nature of the steps they may be preparing to take. There has been a sanctions announcement by Russia on the foreign ministry, the Russian foreign ministry's website, and it is that I'm going to turn to in order to discuss what the Russian sanctions mean. And first of all, it starts with these words. The latest attack by the Biden administration against our country cannot go unanswered. It seems Washington is unwilling to accept that there is no room for unilateral dictates in the new geopolitical reality. Meanwhile, the bankrupt scenarios for deterring Moscow that the US myopically continues to pursue only promise to further degrade Russian-US relations. Note the words about Washington unwilling to accept that there is no room for unilateral dictates in the new geopolitical reality. The geopolitical reality the Russians are talking about is, of course, the resurgence of Russian power, the enormous increase in Chinese power, and the de facto alliance between China and Russia. The Russians are pointing out, though not stating it explicitly, that the United States is not able to deal with them from a position of strength as it once could. And then the Russians go on to say this in this statement. In this context, the appeals from across the ocean to refrain from escalation and essentially accept this attempt to talk to us from a position of strength sound hypocritical. We have repeatedly warned and demonstrated in practice that sanctions and any other pressure will never succeed and will only have dire consequences for those who dare attempt such provocations. Now, what the Russians are saying here is the same point that I have made previously, that this strange inversion of action, whereby President Biden telephones President Putin, talks about the need for a predictable and stable relationship and a normalization for relations, and then the following day imposes sanctions on Russia, gets this thing completely the wrong way round. If the United States had done the reverse, if sanctions had first been imposed on Russia, and then, after waiting for a few days and weeks, the United States had made a move to de-escalate tensions with an offer of a summit, that might have been comprehensible. But doing it the other way round looks to the Russians to be dishonest and, as they say in this statement, hypocritical. By the way, the latest mood music coming from Moscow is that they're not interested in the proposal for a summit and that they're not going to go along with it. From their point of view, it seems to be simply another opportunity by the United States to lecture them on their behavior, and they're looking instead for movement on the crisis in Ukraine, and they're even talking about keeping their troops on the Ukrainian border until the autumn, until the fall, and they've also, of course, announced the closing of the Kerch Strait and the Sea of Azov to warships from Ukraine and from the NATO powers, and have said that will continue until October. So the Russians do not seem at the moment in any sort of mood to accept the President Biden's gestures of goodwill and of negotiations and of a summit which he made to them over the course of that telephone call. Anyway, the Russians have then announced the various measures that they are taking, and some of them are indeed predictable and might have been predicted. Firstly, we know that they've also decided to expel 10 diplomats, and they've also imposed sanctions, or perhaps one should say more correctly, travel bans on the opportunities to travel to Russia of certain important and well-known US officials, including serving officials of the current administration and certain officials who've served in previous administrations. I'm not going to go through this list. It is available in the media. I noticed that Susan Rice, who was the former National Security Advisor in Barack Obama's administration, is on the list. I've noticed that John Bolton, who was Donald Trump's National Security Advisor, is also on the list. It's an inconvenience to these people that they cannot travel to Moscow and engage with the Russians there, but I don't think that this should be taken too seriously. At the end of the day, these kind of sanctions have only token or symbolic significance. Of much more importance is the fact that the Russians are placing more restrictions on the operations of the US Embassy and of US diplomatic staff in Russia, which is going to make it more difficult for the embassy to engage in activities that go beyond its normal and conventional function of maintaining dialogue with the Russian government. Other activities, such as, for example, sending diplomats to attend protests in the Russian capital and elsewhere, and of course the usual things that happen from embassies, such as espionage, well, that is going to become increasingly difficult to do, if not entirely impossible to do. But then come what are for me the two most important steps. The first is this one. Plans are in place to halt the activities in the Russian Federation of American foundations and NGOs controlled by the Department of State and other US government agencies. These consistent long-term efforts will be brought to an end, all the more so since the United States shows no intention of scaling back its systematic subversive efforts underpinned by a wide array of laws. Now, that suggests that there's going to be, in the coming weeks and months, an across-the-board crackdown on American-funded NGOs which operate in Russia and which the Russians have long seen, and by the way, correctly seen, as a vehicle through which the United States provides financial and other support to Russia's anti-Putin liberal opposition. And this has been accompanied, by the way, by police action that the Russians have been taking over the last few days against Alexei Navalny's organization, which is now facing charges in Russia of trying to induce Russian children to participate in protests and the various breaches of the law involving breaches of financing. So I think it looks to me as if the Russians have decided that they're going to end the activities of these NGOs and foundations once and for all, making it in effect impossible for the United States to interfere through these agencies and foundations in Russia and NGOs in Russia in the way it has been consistently doing for the last 30 years. Actually, it is remarkable that it has taken the Russians this long to do this. it has been a sign of extraordinary restraint on the part of the Russians that they have tolerated the United States' so-called democracy promotion exercises in Russia for as long as they have done. But it seems that the Russians are about to call time on them. Now, that is, if I may say, an important practical step. It is one which has more effect than some of the other sanctions that we have been hearing about, both from the United States and from the Russians, and it will make a difference, a real difference to the situation in a way that the American sanctions that the Biden-Harris administration announced and these other sanctions that the Russians have announced won't do. And there is more. And here we come to certain comments that the Russians have made. And they are these. These steps represent just a fraction of the capabilities at our disposal. Unfortunately, US statements threatening to introduce new forms of punishment show that Washington is not willing to listen and does not appreciate the restraint that we have displayed despite the tensions that have been purposefully fueled since the presidency of Barack Obama. And then they go on to say that the Russians accept that they do not have the same economic leverage over the United States that the United States has over them. And these are their words. There are also other options. We realize that we are limited in our ability to squeeze the Americans economically as they have us. However, we have some resources in this respect, and they will also be used if Washington chooses to follow the path of spiraling sanctions. Now, I'm going to make a number of guesses as to what is being talked about here. The first is that the Russians have been making moves over the last few weeks against US tech companies. They acted to impose fines on Twitter, as well, by the way, on US Radio Liberty, but specifically on Twitter. And they threatened Twitter with a complete banning in Russia unless Twitter removed certain material which the Russians found objectionable. They also slowed down Twitter's operations in Russia. Now, after the Russians did that, there was some commentary in parts of the media, especially I noticed in the Financial Times, which called into question whether the Russian slowing of Twitter was actually for real. And there were suggestions that, in fact, it was actually easy to access Twitter in Russia in exactly the same way as had been the case previously. I understand that this is not, in fact, the case, and that Twitter has indeed been facing increasing problems operating in Russia. Certainly, Twitter seems to think so, since they have been negotiating with the Russian authorities and have been trying to meet the Russian authorities' demands by indeed removing an increasing amount of the material that the Russians object to. I suspect that if we are in a situation of escalating sanctions, the Russians will move rapidly, not just against Twitter, but against other US tech companies, including Google and Facebook. Given how important Russian access to those US tech companies is to US soft power in Russia, that will be a significant step, and one which I think the United States would be most unhappy to see. But I think it probably goes even beyond that. I suspect, and this is something I discussed in my big video on Thursday and Friday, that the Russians are probably minded to go much further than this, and that they are already making plans to disconnect themselves from Western payment systems, specifically from Mastercard and Visa, and conceivably or also from SWIFT. They are now sounding increasingly confident that they can do that without this impacting very significantly on their own economy. And they may be calculating that it might be to their advantage to do this themselves preemptively rather than to have the US do it to them. Now, that will, I think, come as a significant shock. I don't think Western governments anticipate or expect the Russians to take a move like that. But I think it may be coming, and I think these words in the Russian Foreign Ministry's statement may hint at that. Probably there are warnings of some kind being given by the Russians discreetly through diplomatic channels that we don't know about. Though I suspect if the Russians are indeed thinking about disconnecting from Visa and Mastercard and from SWIFT, they will not want to make that public. Anyway, we shall see. Now, can I just say straight away, these sanctions that have just been announced do only go so far. There will be, as I said, some inconvenience to some US officials and former officials. They will not be able to travel to Moscow, given that these are all people who work in the national security field and who would presumably want to speak from time to time to their Russian interlocutors. That will be a serious inconvenience to them, but that will not be taken too seriously. The steps against the US embassy and US diplomatic staff in Russia, well, they are of some significance. They will certainly impede the work of the US diplomatic mission in Russia, but they should not be taken too seriously either. The steps against US NGOs and US agencies and foundations operating in Russia and providing financial and other support to the Russian opposition, those are real and will have a real effect over the next few weeks and months and years. They will gradually put growing pressure on Russia's liberal opposition, which will find it increasingly difficult to operate in an increasingly restrictive environment. Having said that, it's also a measure of self-protection. It will not directly impact on the United States itself. Further sanctions barring US tech companies from operating in Russia, if that's what the Russians mean, and also possibly disconnecting Russia from Visa and Mastercard and from SWIFT would be a different matter entirely. The United States would take those extremely seriously, not because they would have any major economic effect on the United States. We have seen that the Russians accept that they do not have any economic leverage over the United States and cannot squeeze the US economy in the way that the United States is trying to squeeze theirs. But it would be a major blow to US soft power efforts in Russia. I think that the United States would certainly not want to see that happen. We will see how the United States responds to all of this, whether they will indeed escalate or take further measures in response to these moves, or whether, as the Russians have advised them to do, they now take the steps to draw back. What I will say again is this. The United States, over the last few weeks and months, found itself in a confrontation with Russia in Ukraine, which was largely of its own choosing. It faces humiliation there as it realizes that it cannot counter Russian military forces in Ukraine to any significant degree. It cannot fight the Russians with any hope of success on this territory, and it would be incredibly dangerous for it to try. The US withdrawal, or rather decision not to send its ships to the Black Sea, is an admission of that. In addition, that extraordinary US report about the Russians having interfered in the US election, having engaged in the solar winds hack, which may be true, by the way, but as I've said, that is classical espionage, and about the Russians having paid bounties to the Taliban to kill US soldiers, which the United States has in effect retracted. That report was also an extraordinary own goal, inducing the United States to impose sanctions which have only token effect, which the United States has undermined itself. I would simply refer you to what I've said about this in my previous videos, and which has only aggravated this situation. It is for the United States to draw the correct conclusions from all of this. If it really does want to make Russia an adversary, and not just an adversary, but even an outright enemy, as it was during the Cold War, and set itself up for a debacle in Ukraine, which would inevitably follow from that, well, then, of course, it can go down that road. There might be some advantages that might increase bloc discipline. It might end Nord Stream 2. It might make the Europeans restive and angry, though some would be about it, more loyal to the United States and to NATO. But I am not sure that that is ultimately to US advantage. After all, as the Russians pointed out in this foreign ministry statement, the geopolitical situation has changed. Russia is resurgent. China is growing fast in economic and military power and is challenging the United States in the South China Sea and elsewhere. And the United States faces multiple full-spectrum challenges in all sorts of places. Does it really want to be locked into a military and geopolitical confrontation with Russia in Eastern Europe when it faces all these challenges in the South China Sea, in the Pacific at the same time, and when it is rapidly losing what leverage it has over the Russian economy? It's for the United States to make that decision. I would have thought not, but I do appreciate that there are many people in the United States who think and want otherwise. It seems to me, as I've discussed in previous programs, that there is a debate about this underway within the United States government between, if you like, the hawks and the doves, to use the language of the Cold War, and specifically of the Vietnam War, or between the neocons and the realists, as I prefer to call it. It's not clear which of these two parties is in the ascendant, and much will depend on which of them does in fact win out, or indeed whether either of them is able to win out conclusively over the other. But it does matter which it is, and the ball, let us be very clear about it, is with the United States. It is with Washington, ultimately, that the major decisions in the future, confrontation with Russia or some kind of normalization of relations with Russia, it's with the United States that that decision must now be made. Thank you for joining me for this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel. I would also ask you to check out our other channel, our main channel, the Duran, where I make programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also check out his channel, Alex's own channel. You'll find links under this video. Please check us out also on our other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, and especially Odyssey. Please also look us up, or rather support us via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar to the extent that you can. Join us also on our Discord server, and please don't forget to look up our shop. See the wonderful things that you can find there, our famous magic mugs, our t-shirts, our hoodies, our hats, our sweatshirts, and remember, you support the Duran by buying these wonderful things from our channel. Thank you for joining me for this program, and I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our other channels, and have a wonderful day until then. And in the meantime, please remember to subscribe to this channel and to our other channels also. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to you joining me again soon. And have a wonderful day until then.